The streets of New York were alive as usual. Cars honking, people rushing past, and the distant hum of the city never stopping. But then, something changed. A pair of police sirens cut through the noise, growing louder, sharper. People turned their heads as a squad car screeched to a stop in the middle of the street. Doors flew open, and two officers jumped out, their movements quick, their expressions tense. The crowd slowed, whispers spreading like wildfire. Who were they after? Then, they saw him. A man, standing alone near a lamppost, hands in his pockets, head slightly tilted. His clothes were plain, his hair a little messy. Nothing about him screamed danger. Yet, the moment the cops laid eyes on him, their hands went straight to their belts. "Don't move," one of them barked, pointing a firm finger at him. The man didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Instead, he smirked. The crowd around them grew, people pulling out their phones, murmuring among themselves. "Who is he?" someone asked. "I don't know," another replied. "Just some guy, I guess." But in the back of the crowd, an older man's face went pale. His breath hitched. They have no idea what they've just done. The two cops moved in fast. No hesitation, no warning. One grabbed the man's arm, yanking it behind his back. The other shoved him hard against the hood of the squad car. "Hands where we can see them," one barked. The man barely reacted. No struggle, no resistance. His clothes were worn, his shirt slightly torn at the collar. He looked like someone who had seen better days. Just another nobody on the streets. But the way he stood, the way he carried himself, it didn't match his appearance. "Think you're real smart, huh?" The second cop sneered, snapping the cuffs around his wrists, tightening them just a little too much. The crowd pressed in closer, murmurs turning into a low buzz of curiosity. Some people laughed, shaking their heads. "Looks like they got him." Another thug off the streets. But the man in cuffs, he only smiled, not a nervous smile, not a forced one, a slow, knowing smirk. And for the first time, the arresting officers felt it. Something was off. To anyone watching, he was just another nobody. His clothes were faded, the fabric stretched and worn from years of use. His shirt hung loose, slightly wrinkled, the collar frayed at the edges. His jeans had seen better days, dust clinging to the fabric, the hems tattered from dragging against the pavement. His hair was unkempt, messy, like he hadn't bothered with a mirror in days. A few strands fell over his forehead, but he didn't brush them away. Most men in his position would be pleading, resisting, demanding to know what was happening. But not him. He stood still. No struggle, no panic, just calm, too calm. And that alone was enough to make the officers uneasy. The two cops exchanged a quick glance, a smirk tugging at the corners of their mouths. Too easy. No struggle, no excuses, no fight. Just another street rat caught in the net. One officer let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Didn't even make us break a sweat." The other tightened his grip on the cuffs, leaning in slightly. "Guess some of them just know when they've lost." The man didn't respond, didn't flinch. He just stood there, his smirk barely noticeable beneath the shadows of the streetlights. And for a brief second, just a flicker of a moment, something about it felt wrong. But the man? He just smirked. Not the smirk of a man caught, not the smirk of someone defeated. It was slow, deliberate, like he was in on a joke no one else understood. His eyes didn't dart around in panic. He didn't plead, didn't protest. He simply stood there, calm, too calm. The officers' smirks faded just a little. For the first time, they felt it. Something wasn't right. The crowd had grown, forming a loose circle around the scene. Some people chuckled, shaking their heads. Just another lowlife getting what he deserved. A few exchanged confused glances. The guy didn't look dangerous, so why were the cops treating him like some big catch? Others simply watched in silence, eyes flicking between the officers and the man in cuffs. There was something off. They couldn't quite put their finger on it, but for some reason, the laughter began to die down. In the middle of the crowd, an older man's breath hitched. His eyes widened as he took a shaky step back. His face paled, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched the strap of his worn-out bag. He knew. A chill ran down his spine as he leaned toward the person next to him and whispered, voice barely above a breath, "They don't know who they've just arrested." The words hung in the air, unnoticed by most. But for those who heard, a cold dread crept in. The officers wasted no time. With firm grips, they shoved the man forward, pushing him into the back of the squad car. The door frame caught his shoulder, but he didn't wince, didn't protest. Most people would be panicking by now, begging, cursing, demanding answers, but not him. He slid into the seat effortlessly, leaning back as if he were settling into a luxury ride. No fear, no tension, just that same unreadable smirk. And for the first time, the cops felt something creeping in. Not satisfaction, not victory, unease. Instead of panicking, he did something the cops didn't expect. He leaned back, casually, comfortably, like a man who had just taken his usual seat, not in the back of a squad car, but in a place he knew well, a place he controlled. His eyes, dark and steady, flicked up to the rearview mirror. And that's when the officers saw it. Not fear, not anger, amusement. As if the whole thing, being arrested, being shoved around, was nothing more than a joke, a game. And he was the only one who knew the rules. One of the officers frowned, pulling out a small notepad and flipping it open. "Let's see who you really are," he muttered, yanking the suspect's wallet from his pocket. A flimsy ID card, a name, a date of birth, routine procedure. Sliding into the front seat, he punched the details into the onboard system. Processing. The screen flickered. A progress bar crawled forward. Then, nothing. No records, no past offenses, no address, no history. Just a blank screen. The officer's jaw tightened. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating. That wasn't possible. Everyone had something in the system, even nobody's. He tried again. Same result. The man in the back seat chuckled softly. Not loud enough to be obvious, just enough to be heard. Enough to make the hairs on the officer's neck stand up. No records, no history, just a blank file. The officer's fingers hovered over the keyboard, his eyes narrowing at the empty screen. This doesn't make sense, he muttered under his breath. Every criminal, every citizen, everyone had something in the system. A past address, a traffic ticket, something. But this guy, it was as if he didn't exist. A cold sensation crept up the officer's spine. Slowly, he turned his head, glancing at the rearview mirror. The man in the back seat was watching him, still smirking, still waiting. "Dispatch, this is Unit 47, requesting confirmation on subject ID. Over." Silence. A few seconds passed. Then, a faint crackle, a burst of static. The officer's brow furrowed. He pressed the radio again. "Dispatch, do you copy? We need a records check. Respond." Nothing. No voices, no codes, no backup. Just dead air. The second officer glanced over. "What's going on?" The first officer shook his head. "I don't know. The system's blank, and now dispatch isn't responding." In the back seat, the man shifted slightly, just enough for his cuffs to rattle. Then, he let out a slow, quiet chuckle. The kind that sent a chill through the already tense air. like he knew exactly what was happening, and worse, like he had been expecting it. The officer behind the wheel swallowed hard, shifting in his seat. His hands, steady just moments ago, now tensed around the steering wheel. Something felt wrong. First, no ID in the system. Then, radio silence. Now, that eerie chuckle from the back seat. He glanced at his partner, who was still staring at the lifeless computer screen, tapping the keys as if trying to force an answer out of it. Nothing. The officer exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. Why did it suddenly feel like they weren't the ones in control? In the mirror, the man in cuffs locked eyes with him, not with fear, not with anger, but with something far worse: amusement. Then, for the first time since his arrest, he spoke. His voice was low, steady, unbothered. "You should have never picked me up." The words hung in the air, thick with something neither officer could quite place. Not a threat, not a plea, just a simple, unsettling fact. The officer in the passenger seat stiffened, glancing over his shoulder. The man wasn't gritting his teeth, wasn't lashing out. He was just sitting there, calm, still, like a man who knew something they didn't. The man tilted his head slightly, eyes gleaming under the dim squad car lights. Then, in that same unsettlingly calm voice, he spoke again. "You have no idea what you've just done, do you?" The words sent a chill through the air, heavier than the silence that followed. The officer in the passenger seat turned fully now, his pulse quickening. His partner gripped the wheel tighter, jaw clenched. This wasn't right. None of this was right. The suspect wasn't scared. He wasn't angry. He was waiting. The two cops marched him through the precinct doors, their grips firm on his arms. No struggle, no resistance. He let them drag him in like he belonged there, like he had walked these halls 100 times before. Other officers glanced up from their desks, some barely paying attention, others pausing mid-conversation. Another arrest, just another nobody off the streets, or so they thought. The officers, still riding on confidence, shoved him toward the booking desk. "Let's get this over with," one of them muttered. But as they reached the desk, the booking officer barely glanced at the suspect before his face drained of color. His hand froze over the keyboard. His breath caught in his throat. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked, "What did you just do?" The booking officer hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keys. Then, finally, he typed in the name. Enter. The screen blinked. A second later, a single result appeared, and the moment the name was spoken aloud, the entire station froze. Conversations stopped. Phones went silent. Every officer, every detective, every rookie in the room turned their heads. Some stood up. Others instinctively reached for their holsters. Eyes widened, breaths hitched. The suspect just stood there, still cuffed, still calm. And then, ever so slightly, he smiled. A detective, mid-sip of his coffee, froze as his eyes locked onto the screen. His fingers went numb. The cup slipped from his grasp, crashing onto the tile. Hot coffee spreading in a dark stain. Across the room, another officer instinctively took a step back, his hand hovering near his holster. A low murmur rippled through the precinct. Confused whispers, stifled gasps. The tension in the air thickened, pressing down like a heavy weight. One officer swallowed hard and muttered under his breath, "This has to be a mistake." But deep down, they all knew it wasn't. The tension in the room snapped as the precinct door burst open. The captain stormed out of his office, his usual commanding presence gone. His face, pale, his hands clenched, his voice unsteady as he barked out, "Tell me this is a joke." Silence. No one moved. No one spoke, because they all saw it. The name on the screen, the name that shouldn't have been there, and the man in cuffs. He just looked at the captain and smirked. The captain's eyes darted between the screen and the two officers standing beside the suspect. His chest rose and fell with controlled, shaky breaths. Then, in a voice that barely masked the fear creeping in, he spoke. "Tell me you didn't just arrest this man." The room remained frozen. The two officers exchanged a glance, confusion flickering in their eyes. "He was causing trouble," one of them muttered. "No ID, no records. We thought—" "You thought?" The captain's voice was sharper now, tinged with something dangerously close to panic. The suspect tilted his head, watching the exchange like a man enjoying the show. Then, with an almost amused sigh, he finally spoke. "Oh, Captain, you should have trained them better." The two officers glanced at each other, their confidence wavering. One of them scoffed, shaking his head. "He's just some thug. A nobody. A street criminal." That's what they thought. That's what they were sure of. But the captain didn't answer. His breathing was uneven now, his fingers tightening into fists. Around the room, other officers weren't just watching anymore. Some had gone pale. Others instinctively reached for their radios, their weapons, anything to prepare. Because they knew. They knew something the arresting officers didn't. And when the captain finally spoke, his voice was cold. "You have no idea who you just put in handcuffs." The captain's throat tightened as he swallowed hard, his face now ghostly pale. He took a slow step back, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, he's the ghost." A ripple of shock spread through the room. Officers stiffened. Some took instinctive steps away. Others whispered the name under their breath like it was a curse. Because the ghost wasn't just a criminal. He was a legend. A man no one could trace. No past, no records, no fingerprints. A shadow in the underworld. The mastermind behind disappearances, heists, and unsolved crimes that left even the FBI clueless. And now, he was standing right in the middle of their precinct, handcuffed, smirking, like he had planned this all along. The station, frozen in fear just moments ago, erupted into chaos. Every phone, every single one, began ringing at the exact same time. Ring. Desks lit up, lines blinked, officers jolted, hesitating before reaching for their receivers. Some answered, others just stared, their hands hovering over the phones, dread tightening in their chests. The captain didn't move. His face was tight, his fists clenched at his sides. He already knew. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a message. And as the calls continued, a chilling realization settled over the room. They hadn't arrested the ghost. He had let them. The overhead lights flickered. The computer screens glitched, lines of code flashing erratically before everything went black. A deep, eerie silence settled over the precinct. Then, one by one, every monitor lit up with the same message. Bold, unmistakable. "You have 1 hour." The officers stared, their blood running cold. 1 hour. For what? The captain's breathing grew shallow. His hands trembled, and from the holding bench, still in cuffs, the ghost chuckled. The message on the screens blinked once, then again, and then new words appeared. "Release him, or none of you make it home tonight." A shiver ran through the room. Officers exchanged panicked glances. Some reached for their radios, only to hear nothing but static. No dispatch, no backup. The station was completely cut off. The captain's throat went dry. His mind raced. This wasn't a bluff. This was a promise. And sitting there, still cuffed, still calm, the ghost just smiled. A sharp clank echoed through the precinct. One officer rushed to the door, gripping the handle, yanking hard. It wouldn't budge. Another officer tried the emergency override. Nothing. They were trapped. The fluorescent lights above flickered wildly, casting long, shifting shadows across the walls. The air turned thick with dread. A few officers reached for their weapons, hands slick with sweat. The captain's voice was low, almost shaking. He's not just a ghost on the streets. He turned slowly toward the man in cuffs. He's a ghost in our systems too. And across the room, the ghost, still seated, still restrained, grinned like he was already in control. From the narrow station windows, flashing red and blue lights reflected against the glass. But these weren't police lights. Outside, black SUVs lined the street, sleek, unmarked, and ominous. One by one, the doors opened in perfect sync. Dozens of men stepped out. No badges, no uniforms, just dark suits, cold eyes, and an eerie, unnatural silence. They didn't speak. They didn't move toward the building. They just stood there, waiting. Inside, an officer swallowed hard, backing away from the window. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Who the hell are they?" And from the holding bench, the ghost finally leaned forward. His smirk widened. His voice, calm, controlled, certain. "They're here for me." A younger officer, barely a year on the force, took an uneasy step back. His throat was dry, his hands trembling. He glanced at the captain, then back at the dark figures outside. His voice cracked as he stammered, Backup?" No one answered. No sirens, no distant screech of police cruisers racing to their aid. Just silence, heavy, suffocating. The captain exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand down his face. "Son," his voice was barely above a whisper, "we are the backup." And in the holding area, the ghost chuckled under his breath. "You were." The captain stood frozen, his breath unsteady. His gaze remained locked on the dark figures outside, unmoving, waiting. The younger officer swallowed hard. "Key, Captain?" But the captain didn't look at him. Instead, he shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. "No, that's not backup." He exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. Then, with grim certainty, he finished. "That's his men." The room fell deathly silent. The officers turned to the ghost, still cuffed, still seated, and for the first time since his arrest, he leaned forward. A slow, knowing smirk spread across his face. "Now you're starting to get it." The ghost, still cuffed, still completely in control, leaned forward, slowly, deliberately. His smirk never faded. The officers tensed. Hands hovered over holsters. No one spoke. No one breathed. Then, in a voice so calm, so eerily certain, he finally broke the silence. "Now, what's it gonna be, Captain?" The ghost tilted his head, his smirk widening. This was fun. His voice was smooth, almost amused, like this was nothing more than a game. He glanced around the room, taking in the stiffened officers, the fear in their eyes. Then, leaning back casually, he added, "But I have places to be." Outside, the men in black suits still waited, still watching. The station doors remained locked, and deep down, every officer in that room knew. This wasn't their decision anymore. Slowly, deliberately, the ghost turned his head and locked eyes with the two officers who had arrested him. His smirk deepened, but his gaze? Cold, calculated, unreadable. The officers stiffened. A bead of sweat rolled down one's temple. For the first time since they cuffed him, they felt like the ones being watched. The ghost studied them, almost as if memorizing their faces. Then, in a voice quiet, but heavy with meaning, he said, "I hope you enjoyed your little victory." He leaned in just slightly, because it's the last one you'll ever have. The ghost's smirk lingered, but his eyes, sharper now, focused. He tilted his head, studying the two arresting officers like they were pieces of a puzzle. Then, in a voice laced with quiet menace, he asked, "Tell me, who gave you my name?" The room felt smaller, the air thicker. The officers didn't answer. They couldn't. The ghost let the silence hang for a beat longer, then exhaled softly, almost disappointed. "Because now, I need to pay them a visit." And just like that, the power flickered again. A chilling silence settled over the room. No one spoke. No one moved. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their hands tightening into fists. The captain's throat went dry. He could hear his own heartbeat, slow, heavy, uncertain. The ghost? He simply sat there, his smirk fading into something far more unsettling. Patience, confidence, certainty. It wasn't a question of if he would walk out of there. It was only a question of when. The room stood frozen. Then, click. A sharp metallic sound echoed through the precinct. Every officer turned toward the entrance. The heavy station doors, once sealed shut, now stood slightly ajar. A slow, cold dread crept over them. No one had moved. No one had touched the controls. And yet, the doors had unlocked. The ghost exhaled softly, stretching his fingers as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. Then, with a knowing smirk, he stood up. Inside the station, no one moves. No one dares to. Outside, the men in suits remain perfectly still, a wall of silent power. Then, as if on cue, they step aside, parting in perfect formation. No words, no signals, just obedience. They aren't here to fight. They aren't here to negotiate. They're here for one reason only: to escort their boss home. The ghost adjusts his cuffs, smooths out his ragged-looking jacket, a disguise he no longer needs. Then, without a glance back, he steps forward, walking straight through the open doors. The ghost is gone. The room remains frozen, the weight of what just happened sinking in like a heavy fog. The younger officer swallows hard, his hands still trembling. No one speaks. No one moves. Then, the captain exhales, slow and shaky. He runs a hand down his face, his voice barely above a whisper. "You just made the worst mistake of your lives." Outside, the black SUVs pull away, silent, controlled. But deep down, everyone inside that station knew this wasn't over. The ghost steps outside, untouched, unbothered, unstoppable. The air is thick with tension, but he walks as if he owns the very ground beneath him. Not a single officer dares to follow. Not a single word is spoken. The men in suits stand waiting, their presence alone enough to keep the city at bay. Without hesitation, the ghost moves forward, slipping into the waiting SUV. A door closes, the engine hums, and just like that, he's gone. One by one, the black SUVs pull away, their headlights cutting through the darkness. No sirens, no screeching tires, just a smooth, calculated exit, as if nothing ever happened. The officers inside the precinct watch in stunned silence, their breaths held, their pulses racing. Out on the street, pedestrians glance around, confused. Who was that man? Why did the cops let him go? But the truth? It wasn't up to them. It never was. The last SUV rounds a corner, and then, just like that, they vanish into the night. The officers stand there, frozen. No one speaks. No one moves. The weight of what just happened settles in, thick and suffocating. Their hands still hover near their holsters, but they know. Guns wouldn't have changed a thing. The captain exhales sharply, shaking his head. Because now, they all realize. They never had control. Not for a second. They didn't arrest him. He let them. And worse, They just started a war. They'll never be able to win. The officers exchange uneasy glances, their faces pale, their hands still trembling. The precinct, once loud and commanding, now feels empty, powerless. One of them finally mutters under his breath, "Was this really an arrest?" The question hangs in the air, suffocating. Because deep down, they all know the truth. This wasn't justice. This wasn't control. This was a warning. The room stays eerily silent. No one dares to answer. Because the truth is sinking in now. Cold, undeniable. One officer swallows hard, his voice barely a whisper. Or did we just deliver him exactly where he wanted to be? The realization sends a chill down their spines. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't bad luck. It was a setup. And they were never the hunters. They were the pawns. The question lingers in the air, thick with dread. And if so, what happens next? No one answers. No one can answer. Because whatever happens next, it won't be their choice. Somewhere out there, in the shadows of the city, he's already making his next move. And by the time they see it coming, it'll be too late.